Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Tom Hastings, and I am an educator here at Cheehaw Park and Zoo and Flint River Aquarium. And today we have a really cool topic for you that's going to look at some differences between ectotherms and endotherms. So we are going to talk about what ectotherms and endotherms are and what some of their differences are to really get a better understanding of how they differ. And so we're going to focus a little bit on differences in regulating body temperature to really understand these two different animal groups, but we're also going to talk about some other differences in general. So to help us understand this, I am going to share my screen and we will get started. Okay. So first, I figured we could just start by going over in general what an endotherm and an ectotherm are. And so really the big difference between endotherms and ectotherms is how they control or regulate their body temperature. So endotherms can regulate their body temperature through heat production internally, and ectotherms cannot. So they rely more on their environment, and their body temperature is going to shift based on changes in temperatures in their surrounding environment. So while those are the key differences, I figured it'd be really interesting to dive into some of the different mechanisms or strategies or even adaptations that animals have in these two different groups to understand how they're able to actually regulate body temperature. Because regulating body temperature is important to all organisms, no matter what category they fall in. And that's because at a minimum, they want to prevent the extremes from happening, such as ice molecules forming within cells in their body if the temperatures get really cold. Um, so ice will actually crystallize, right? And that can puncture important organs and cells. And that's not going to be great. And also, some proteins can denature if it gets way too hot. So they need to keep their body temperature within a range that's going to be ideal. And further from preventing the extremes from happening, animals in general also like to keep their body temperature within a range that's most ideal for them to be able to efficiently use energy and not overexpend energy to keep themselves properly functioning. Okay, so we can talk about different strategies or again mechanisms, right, in which animals actually do regulate their body temperature. And so one way we're going to start by focusing on just energy, using energy to regulate body temperature. And so one of the ways they do this is through something called thermogenesis. And so what this is the idea that heat is generated by animals' metabolism. And so your metabolism is basic chemical reactions within your body that has life-sustaining functions. So things such as converting food to energy, using energy for growth. These are all examples of your metabolism and functions that they have within your body. But when these different functions or chemical reactions are occurring, heat is produced. And so animals, therefore, can regulate, or I shouldn't say animals, I should say endotherms can regulate their metabolic heat production in order to keep themselves warmer or cooler. And so one example of this is through muscle contraction. So if you increase muscle contractions, that takes energy. And so when you're increasing your energy, you're increasing your metabolism. And so there are things such as involuntary muscle contractions. So what does everybody do if they get cold? Does anybody have an idea of what they do if they get cold? Sometimes you shiver, right? And so that shivering is increasing muscle contractions and movement involuntarily, but ultimately that's going to be requiring and burning energy, and that is going to produce some extra heat and warm animals up. And then there can be voluntary movements such as increasing activity, movement, um, walking around. Sometimes when I get really cold, I'll walk around to keep myself warmer. It's better than just standing still, right? So if you think about it, that's us increasing our energy expenditure through moving, or we'll rub our hands together to warm them up. So these are all examples of muscle contractions, whether they be involuntary or voluntary, that will increase your metabolic heat production, which is really cool. And another example, or something else that animals have, endotherms have, that's really cool, is what's called brown fat. So This is essentially some type of fat that contains special proteins that release energy through, fuel or metabolic heat production directly as heat. And so that's a good way for them to warm themselves up as well. Now, the big key distinction here is that endotherms can actually purposefully generate metabolic heat and do that to regulate their body temperature. So if things cool down, they will try to increase their metabolic heat production so that they can maintain a controlled and stable body temperature regardless of what their environmental conditions surrounding them are. Ectotherms cannot control heat production. Now, they do get some heat through metabolic processes, but it's not voluntary. They can't control it. They can't increase it if they need to maintain a stable body temperature. But of course, all animals, they convert food to energy and they use energy for growth. So they are still going to get some heat from this. It's just not something that they can regulate or control for producing heat. So that's the big distinction here, which is pretty interesting to think about. Okay. There's also some really cool circulatory mechanisms that animals can use to control the loss or gain of heat. So it's not necessarily them producing it internally, but it can help control how much they actually lose. So if you're losing less heat, you're inevitably maintaining a warmer body temperature, right? And that's going to help you stay warmer. And so we have these two processes called vasoconstriction and vasodilation. And so what this idea is it's all related to blood vessels that are near the skin. Now, this is really important because one of our biggest points of transfer of heat, or animals' transfer of heat, is going to be near the skin. You can lose heat across your skin. And so you want to kind of control how much blood is going to go towards that skin because it will lose heat. And so blood comes from the core. We're warmer in the core or in the center of our bodies. And so this idea of vasoconstriction, say, is if animals want to maintain heat and lose less heat across their skin, they are going to shrink blood vessels that are leading towards our surface of our skin. That way, less blood can flow to the skin and less heat will be lost. And so the opposite is vasodilation, which is the blood vessels will be dilated, they'll be expanded, much more blood will be able to flow towards the skin of animals, and they'll be able to give off a lot of heat to the environment and lose heat. So a really cool example of this is the jackrabbit here, and what you can see is they have really large ears with a lot of surface area, and what's actually happening is they have complex networks of blood vessels running through those ears. And so to stay cool or to give off more heat in dry, hot environments, they will dilate their blood vessels into those ears, and then a lot of blood will flow into the ears and be lost across those larger surface area ears as a way to give off a lot of heat in this environment and try to stay cooler. So really cool example of an animal in an environment that has this adaptation to stay cool. But that's not just something that's done in endotherms. So that jackrabbit is a mammal, which is our endotherm, right? But then we have our ectotherms, such as a reptile like this iguana. And so they will do the other form of this mechanism, which is vasoconstriction. So when they swim in water, they will actually shrink up their blood vessels that are leading towards their skin. They don't want as much blood to flow towards their skin when they're in the water, because the water is going to be cooler than their internal core body temperature. So they want to try to maintain their body temperature when they're in this cooler water. So they'll limit how much blood can flow towards the skin, and therefore how much heat is lost from their body to the water. And so we'll talk about this a little bit more in a bit, but this is really important because there's this key idea that essentially heat will transfer from warmer areas to cooler areas. So when that iguana goes into the water, it's going to be the warmer surface or the warmer object. So they are going to lose heat to that environment since the water is cooler than them. And so what they'll often do is they'll bask, they'll pull in heat, increase their body temperature that way, and then they'll try to conserve that heat that they gained on land through this vasoconstriction once they go into the water. So there are examples of endotherms and ectotherms that can use some of these circulatory methods for increasing heat loss or reducing heat loss to their environment. And then another really interesting, I think this is super cool, a really interesting form of circulatory mechanisms for controlling heat loss or gain is this idea of countercurrent heat exchange. And so this idea is similar in that different body parts of animals may be more exposed or more susceptible to losing heat across them. And so animals, again, will kind of form these complex systems within their bodies or different parts of their body. So we can see it's happening here in bird legs, where they have complex networks of veins and arteries, again, where blood is moving through. And these veins and arteries will have semi-permeable membranes that will allow different things to move through it. So if it's semi-permeable, that means things like blood can move through the membranes of those veins and arteries. And so what happens is in these complex networks, a lot of veins and arteries will be running close to each other. And this idea is that if blood is flowing from the core down to things like limbs, like the legs and the feet, which are more exposed, and a lot of birds, there's not a whole lot of feathers covering them, right? And we'll talk about why feathers are important and things like that. But regardless, there's more exposure for things like limbs, and so that can be a site of heat loss. And so what they'll do is they will run arteries and veins in different directions. It's really important, right? Counter current, they have to be flowing in opposite directions. And so warm blood that's coming from the core and from, say, like the heart and flowing down into these limbs will run really close to other veins and arteries that are carrying blood back out of those limbs and further up towards the body to be rewarmed and reoxygenated, right? And so, but what will happen is they will transfer heat among them so that there's not an extreme and so that the foot doesn't ever get too cold, or on the opposite end of the spectrum, they don't want blood running directly from their foot that's cooled down straight back up into their core, because that's really going to cool the core down. And so the whole idea of these complex networks is to prevent the direct movement of hot blood that's going to go straight to the foot and just be lost across the surfaces of the foot to the environment. So they're going to lose a lot of heat that way. And then also at the same time, they don't want blood running straight from the foot directly back up to the core, because that's going to reduce core body temperatures. It can lead to things like hypothermia if some of these animals are found in cool enough environments. And so they want to have this gradient happening where, you know, they can keep the foot warm enough by having this warm blood running through to not have any damage done to it, but they relatively keep it cool in general because they don't want to waste a lot of heat. And then also they want to prevent really cold blood from going back up to the core. So really cool idea of a way that animals can prevent hypothermia or even lose a whole lot of heat across surfaces within these more exposed limbs. So one of the most popular examples of this, you'll often see images with this countercurrent heat exchange happening in the feet of birds like ducks or something, because, right, those feet are often going to be found too in the water, which can be cooler, again, similar to that iguana. And so they want to have ways of, you know, having a gradient and maintaining temperature within these limbs that are going to be in cooler environments, such as the water. But it doesn't just happen in birds. And I should mention that birds are also an example of an endotherm. So they are warm-blooded. And so this is a mechanism used by them. But we also see it happen in other animals that have limbs that may be exposed. So for example, you can see this beaver also has webbed feet and this tail that, you know, is not covered in fur like the rest of the animal. So these are extra surfaces or areas where heat could be lost if they don't create this gradient and prevent heat loss and regulate that body temperature. And then it could also be a site for blood to get really cooled down and then have that blood flow back up to the core. And so these complex networks of veins and arteries is important for animals that have exposed surfaces like this. Animals like sloths will do it if they have extended limbs to regulate temperature in those limbs. Animals found in really extreme environments like this Arctic fox have these complex networks in their legs so that they can prevent damage or to prevent hypothermia within their core. So lots of examples of animals. These are just some examples. Other animals also have this countercurrent heat exchange occurring. But a really cool mechanism to regulate body temperature. Okay, and then still, so those are all examples of endotherms. These are still both endotherms. So what I have here is a whale and a bear. So what I wanted to talk about on this slide is something else that helps keep animals warm or prevent loss of heat to the environment. And that's this idea of insulation. So I have the whale on here because they use blubber, or essentially fat, that is a really nice insulating layer that will help prevent loss of heat across their skin to the environment, those cold environments. And then animals such as bears, all of our mammals have fur and hair, unless you're something like a whale here that has blubber instead. Fur or hair to help create a space where air can get trapped close to the skin or the body, and that air will stay a little bit more warm since it's in that hair, and it'll create kind of a barrier to the environment itself, and that barrier will hopefully help maintain some heat within the body. So I have a couple other examples I'm going to show you really quick. So you can see that things like black bears, they do have a nice layer of fur and hair, and it's quite deep, so there's plenty of space for air to get trapped close to the skin. And again, it's this idea that that space close to the skin inside the hair is really going to create a site where air can get trapped and maintain a warmer temperature than the surrounding environment. But mammals aren't the only animals that have insulating features as endotherms. So like I mentioned earlier, birds are also endotherms, and they do have feathers, and some feathers can be really good at insulating animals, and that's particularly, so here's things like our flight feathers, right? Those aren't going to be the best at insulation, but feathers found closer towards the body that are a little bit softer and you know, the feathers found closer to the body, those are going to be the ones that are going to be important for insulation and doing similar processes such as fur and hair in trapping air closer to the body. And so some of those are called down feathers, and you're not really going to see those feathers too often. Those are going to be more of the feathers that are found underneath things such as these flight wings, your primary and secondary wings. Down feathers are going to be the feathers found right against the skin or body of the bird. Okay, and so to provide another general comparison, ectotherms, so things such as our reptiles and our amphibians, they don't really have insulating features. Instead, what they have is something more similar to scales. So our ectotherms have more scaly skin, especially if you're a reptile. And so the skin is important for a number of different reasons. So it does have really good uses, just not necessarily for insulation. So for example, reptile skin is really important for maintaining moisture in their body. So animals oftentimes don't want to lose moisture to their environment. So having these scales and this layer around their body can be good for retaining moisture. Some lizards, such as skinks, have really closely packed scales that prevent things like dust and dirt from getting into their scales. So it can help keep animals clean. It can help keep things like parasites off them. So when they shed their scales, this outer layer, It can be a way for them to clean themselves and clean off anything that may be attached to them. So scales and sheds are really important, but they don't provide the same insulating qualities that endotherms do. So that's another big advantage that endotherms, such as our mammals and our birds, have, is that they have that extra layer that even helps keep them even more warm. But I guess while we're talking about comparisons and advantages versus disadvantages, going back to things like metabolic heat production and using energy, one big advantage that ectotherms have, such as our reptiles and our amphibians, so snakes, lizards, turtles, frogs, since they can't control metabolic heat production, one big advantage they have is they're not as, pressed for food as endotherms. So they don't have to, eat as much as endotherms may have to have that food source and that energy available to burn to generate their heat. So they're not as stressed in terms of finding and having enough food resources available for heat production specifically. Whereas endotherms, since they need to regulate their body temperature and they need to burn energy to maintain stable core body temperatures, they're going to need food and resources and energy to make that happen. And so, food can be a limiting source for them. So that's one big distinction as well. While endotherms have the advantage of being able to regulate body temperature, they also have to put in the work to find food, so they have the energy to do so. So I think that's cool to mention as well. All right, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. So again, this was just another example of a way in which you can limit heat loss to your environment, is having those insulating factors. And then there are some evaporative mechanisms that can help you lose heat to your environment or to cool yourself down. And actually, this can be seen in endotherms and ectotherms. So animals like frogs have super permeable skin. So right, we were talking about earlier, the permeable membranes in the blood arteries and veins that can transfer heat across. Well, frogs have super permeable skin, which has the same meaning. It means that things can move across that skin found on the frog or a salamander or any amphibians. And so oftentimes water can move across their skin. They can absorb water through their skin as well as air. But what that means is they can bring water in, which is really nice for staying hydrated, but they can just as easily lose water across their skin. But this may actually be something that they utilize if they need to cool down. So it's something called evaporative water loss, and evaporative water loss can have a cooling effect. So as water is lost across the skin, it'll also transfer heat. And so if they really need to cool down, they may actually increase their evaporative water loss rates as a cooling mechanism, which is pretty cool. But mammals and endotherms also have strategies for cooling themselves through evaporative mechanisms. So what's this dog doing here? What do we see our dogs doing right after they run and they get all hot? They pant, right? And we breathe heavy after we go for a run, right? So we increase our respiration. But what's happening is moisture is being lost across surfaces in the mouth, such as their tongue and other areas in their mouth, through short kind of pants. And so what they're doing is they're expelling moisture and losing heat through that process of panting. So that's really cool. And then kind of similar to that as well. So what's unique to mammals only, not birds, so only our mammal endotherms, is that they can sweat. And so that's also, right, losing moisture across our skin. And that can be a way of regulating body temperature through losing heat. So when we go on a run, we get sweaty and we get hot, right? But that's actually us trying to thermoregulate. And so mammals can control some body temperature, and so can amphibians or ectotherms through evaporative processes or mechanisms, which is really interesting to think about. Okay, so we've talked a lot about different strategies, and although some of them have applied to our ectotherms as well, we haven't really talked about how ectotherms primarily regulate their body temperature. And so since they can't generate or control their body temperature internally, they have to do it another way. And so they primarily do this behaviorally. So that means they are going to position themselves. Primarily, the two ideas are they're going to position themselves in the sun if they want to warm up, and they're going to move to shade or shelter if they want to cool down. And so that's because animals absorb heat from solar radiation. So what these turtles are doing is they are all positioning themselves in direct contact with the sun. They're absorbing solar radiation. And this is a little bit more complex than it seems. There are lots of different mechanisms happening. So not only are they directly absorbing solar radiation to warm up, it can also reflect off other surfaces. So it's likely reflecting off the water and they're absorbing it that way. There's different things to consider, such as the solar absorbance of the surfaces of animals themselves. So if you're a darker object, you're going to absorb more heat than you are if you're a lighter object that's reflecting more sunlight back, right? So that has an impact on how much solar radiation animals, like our reptiles, our turtles here, are going to gain when they're basking. But we also see some other cool things that starts to make sense when we think about the fact that reptiles primarily have to rely on behavioral mechanisms for maintaining body temperature. And so sometimes we'll see snakes on roads, right? And that's because, again, it comes back to this idea that darker surfaces pick up more heat. And so therefore, heat can also be transferred through surfaces. It doesn't have to just be absorbed directly through solar radiation. So sometimes it's actually really cool. Scientists can go out and do something called road cruising, where they actually drive around after the sun has gone down to look for snakes on the road. And that's because surfaces like pavement are going to be able to retain heat longer than just the changing air temperature. And so snakes may actually be found on roads to increase the amount of time that they can be pulling heat from the road even right after sunset. So they won't stay out there, too long, but it's a nice way for them to continue to gain some heat from different surfaces. And so that's why you can see them sometimes driving around on the road. So these pictures do a good job at demonstrating that. And I remember I talked about that earlier, this idea that heat is always going to move from a warmer surface or object to a cooler one. So that's a good way of demonstrating this as well. So snakes position themselves on these warm objects so that they can pick up some heat and regulate body temperature. And reptiles are very good at doing this. So they can maintain pretty stable body temperatures by behaviorally repositioning themselves and maintaining body temperatures like that. And so there are other ectotherms, not just reptiles and amphibians, right? So there are insects, invertebrates that are ectotherms. And so similar to those snakes, things like grasshoppers will position themselves in the sun or the shade, depending on if they need to cool down or warm up. And there's actually some really cool butterflies that can get even more in depth with their behaviors so that they can thermoregulate. So if you think about it, wings are a big surface area for butterflies, and so they can actually alter, whether or not they want to close their wings and minimize surface area, or even open their wings and position themselves in a way that they're maximizing surface area in relationship to the angle of the sun. So if they really need to warm up, if they're found in cooler environments, they can spread their wings and maximize the surface area that's exposed to the sun so that they can pull in more solar radiation and heat up their bodies. So just really cool examples of other ectotherms that also behaviorally thermoregulate. And while this is the primary mechanism for ectotherms, some endotherms behaviorally help regulate their body temperature. So animals like elephants, right, will spray themselves with cool water. Mammals will also relocate to shade if they get too hot. There's nothing saying mammals can't, be selective as to where they're found during the day to control body temperature. So there's definitely some mechanisms there for endotherms as well. And that is all I had for you. But I'm going to check to see if there are any questions about any of this. I don't see any, but I hope you all found this really interesting, a nice, cool comparison of a way of looking a little bit more in depth and differences between endotherms and ectotherms related to how they regulate their body temperature. So I hope you all found this interesting and enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. Thanks so much. Bye.